Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I was going to talk about today, I'm going to start by just introducing the work of Global Witness a little bit to all of you, but I was going to focus, outline a little bit of the issues of the links between natural resources, conflict, and corruption. Dr. Gilfillan did a great job of giving you a good background on that, though. So I'm going to actually spend quite a bit of time on some case studies to show the problems, this link between natural resources and conflict and corruption, just so we have some concrete case studies. And then talk about what are some of the solutions, what are some of the ways to improve the governance of resources so that they benefit citizens in the country, so that they promote stability instead of conflict. And talk particularly about some U.S. Policies as well, and maybe end with some concrete ways in which the U.S. government, maybe all of you in your roles, can help promote better management of natural resources. First, just a little bit about Global Witness. For those of you who don't know, we are an international advocacy organization, and for nearly 20 years, we've focused on exposing how natural resources fuel conflict, corruption, human rights abuses, and environmental abuses. We've investigated in the countries into how timber, diamonds, minerals, oil incentivize corruption, destabilize governments, and fuel conflicts. And what we do is we take the research and the investigative work that we do and bring that to policymakers and promote policy change. And we do this not just, my particular focus is here in the U.S. with the U.S. government. We work in Europe, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and so all over the world. And we're very focused on the resource-rich countries and trying to improve governance in those countries. So just on the problem of the resource curse, which you've already heard about, and obviously there's a lot of academic literature about the resource curse. There's a lot of different development NGOs and other NGOs working on this issue, and with the basic premise that countries rich in natural resources tend to have worse development outcomes and less economic growth than countries with fewer natural resources. And in our investigations, and this is not just in Africa, but in resource-rich countries globally, we find over and over again that these countries are mired in poverty because public revenues from the extractive sector are squandered through corruption and lack of government accountability. And when you look at the case of Africa, as you've already heard, Africa has great natural resource wealth. And just to put it into broader context, in 2010, the value of exports of oil and minerals from Africa was worth $333 billion. And this is nearly 7 times the value of international aid, which was $48 million. So there's a great potential for the wealth in Africa to contribute to development. But when you look at the 20 resource-rich African countries defined by the IMF, they languish at the bottom of the Human Development Index. Now, there's a resource governance index developed by the Revenue Watch Institute, and they evaluate the resource governance of the oil, gas, and mining sectors. And they found that 16 out of the 21 African countries they looked at had weak or failing scores. And they look at a lot of different factors like the ability of freedom of speech and ability of civil society to operate. They look at institutions. They look at the law. So they look at all different aspects of the country when they assess those scores. And of course, we have many cases of natural resources fueling brutal conflicts, not just in Africa, but globally. And for Global Witness, one of the conflicts that we exposed was diamonds fueling civil wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Angola. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the case studies. So now just to go into the case studies to illustrate what we're seeing. And this is really through some of our investigations and research. And I wanted to focus on 2 countries. I wanted to focus on Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Nigeria, everyone knows, it's the largest producer of oil in Africa, yet the citizens in the country remain among the poorest in the world. For Global Witness, we have looked in a specific case. I know there's a lot of attention on Shell and their activities in Nigeria, but we've looked in a specific case that has come out through a court case in New York. And this is a case where it was reported in 2012 that the Nigerian subsidiaries of Shell and Eni is an Italian oil company, agreed to pay the Nigerian government $1 billion to acquire an oil block. This is called Oil Block 245. Now, these court documents also revealed that the Nigerian government agreed in the same month, after receiving that payment from Shell and Eni, to pay precisely the same amount to Malibu Oil and Gas, a company widely reported as controlled by Abacha-era Minister Dan Atete. He was convicted in France in 2007 of money laundering. So in essence, what we had is Atete awarded the oil block to Malibu Oil Gas while he was oil minister during the regime of a corrupt dictator. He had effectively given himself one of the most lucrative oil blocks in Nigeria. And this case demonstrates details that information of this nature only come to light through the accident of a court case in London and New York. Otherwise, Global Witness and the middleman that brought this case to the court would never have found out, the world would never have found out about this. So this shows the kind of opaque deals that happen not just in Nigeria, but many other resource-rich countries. And the fact that it's very important to try to bring these kind of deals and payments out into the open. Now, I wanted to switch to another country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I wanted to focus there on the secret sales of mining assets. This is another secretive deal, like the case of Nigeria. And basically, it shows what can go wrong when natural resource deals are negotiated in a secretive and unaccountable manner. Now, this deal was investigated by Global Witness, and it was also highlighted in the Africa Progress Report panel, which was in Dr. Gilfillan's presentation, and I have to say is a great report if you want to read about natural resources in Africa. It's a really wonderful resource about the resource potential for the resource wealth in Africa to contribute to development, and they have great infographics. But anyway, the Progress Panel report basically showed that Congo may have lost at least $1.36 billion from the underpriced sales of copper and cobalt mining assets between 2010 and 2012. And these were in deals involving companies in overseas territories, British overseas territories. Now, this $1.36 billion that they lost is almost twice the country's annual spending on health and budget education combined. And these deals, again, they were carried out behind closed doors in secret. And they were sold to companies, offshore companies, whose ownership we didn't know. Who the owners of these companies was unknown, because they're not required to disclose that in the tax havens where they are. So this again is one of the challenges, as you have DRC as one of the most natural resource rich country, but ranks at the bottom of the Human Development Index, and you've got 1 in 5 children dying before the age of 5. But yet you have these kind of secretive deals happening where what's happening is that you have corrupt, of government officials, private companies that are pocketing tons of money at the expense of the DRC. And I went to DRC in October and was in Kinshasa and was inspired to see a really vibrant civil society group and reformers within the government trying to change all of that. There's some really good efforts going on with because of the natural resource corruption being exposed. All of this is out in the open, and so hopefully that's going to bring about change. But maybe we could talk a little bit about that. But I think that the case in the DRC really shows what happens when you have these secretive deals, done behind closed door without any accountability, and how that impacts and robs the country and the citizens of these natural resource revenues. And I just wanted to mention that it's not just bad for the citizens in the country, it's also bad for the United States, for our companies. If there's a lot of distrust, we heard in the last presentation that there's a lot of citizens are expecting rewards from natural resource revenues, and when they don't see it, they not only can get angry at the government, they can also get angry at the companies. And we hear companies tell us we want to be transparent about how we're contributing to government coffers because we want to build trust with the citizens in the country. So I think that's another important element to all of this. And now just to touch upon the issue of minerals and natural resources fueling conflict and human rights abuses. I just heard in the last presentation the different theories about the role of resources in fueling conflict, whether they're the driver, whether they're the main cause of it. And I think what we've found in our work is that natural resources are a main driver of conflicts. They may not be the reason why the conflict originally started, but they're then used by the warring parties to continue to perpetuate the conflict. One conflict that we've been working on is the Eastern DRC, the conflict in the Eastern DRC, where we've investigated how for over 15 years armed groups and members of the National Congolese Army have used the profits from the trade in minerals, tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold, to finance themselves in their operations. And it's been a war that has cost over 5.4 million lives. So it's been a major drive. And again, it's this competition over the natural resource trade. And it's been an incentive for the warring parties to continue fighting. And these are the metals that are mined in the DRC and that get into global markets quite easily and make their way into products that we're using every day in our lives, like our mobile phones, our airplanes, jewelry, and that kind of thing. So this is just one example of resources fueling instability. But the one is that we also focus on is oil and how the oil can fuel instability. And I think the events in South Sudan are another great issue of concern. The recent violence that we saw around the holiday time at the end of last year, we were very concerned about the ability of the government to safeguard the country's natural resources in the face of armed opposition. We've been working there for quite a while to call for better governance of the oil revenues, but we're very much concerned that there is a huge amount of risk of corruption and conflict. And of course, between South Sudan and Sudan, there's been a longstanding issue around that as well that has fueled instability. Now I wanted to focus on what are the solutions, because I think the good news is that we're at a really important time right now. There's a lot of global momentum on improving governance of natural resources. There's a lot of awareness that this is an issue and it can be complex, but I think there's growing recognition that there are things that can be done to improve the chances that resources will actually contribute to a country's development and to break that link between resources and instability. And again, I would really urge all of you to take a look at the Africa Progress Panel report, because that report really, showcases a vision for how Africa can work to ensure that its resources contribute to development. In fact, it states that if there's greater transparency and better governance, and that can be effectively harnessed and well managed, so that Africa's resource wealth could lift millions out of poverty over the next decade. And I think one of the main focuses of the report and of many groups now globally is transparency. And this is transparency across the value chain. It means it's not just transparency of the payments that oil companies are making to a government. It means transparency from the very beginning to when the government decides on how to allocate an oil, gas, and mining rate, to the contract itself, and to who ultimately owns the contract, who's behind the companies getting the bids, and to where is the money going once the revenues get into the government coffers. How are they spent? Are they spent in ways to contribute to development on health and education? Because a lot of times money also goes missing at that point. And of course, part of this whole debate should include the decision of whether you should extract the resource in the first place. And sometimes, many times there isn't really a debate about that, and there's obviously implications for communities and for citizens as to whether it makes sense to extract a resource. So that needs to be also part of the discussion and the debate. So just a few more specifics on this global trend of transparency. I wanted to talk about some U.S. policy measures, which is exciting that the U.S. government took leadership role on this issue of promoting transparency in the extractive sector. And they did this through the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed in 2010. There's two provisions in that act, which we believe are very important. There's a provision on Section 1502, the conflict minerals provision, which aims to cut off financing to armed groups involved in the mineral trades in Eastern DRC. And it does this by requiring companies who are registered in the SEC, companies that are using these conflict minerals, to carry out due diligence in their supply chains to make sure they're not sourcing minerals that are funding armed groups. And they have to not just do this due diligence, but they need to report on it publicly through their reporting to the SEC. So consumers, investors, and others can actually find out what they're doing, if they're sourcing minerals, conflict minerals or not, and what actions are they taking to address it. Another important provision in Dodd-Frank is Section 1504. It's the natural resource disclosure provision. And again, it's trying to tackle this problem, this secrecy around natural resource deals. It requires any oil, gas, and mining company listed on the SEC to have to disclose the payments that it's making to all countries of operation, all foreign governments, and to the U.S. government if there is on federal lands. And it requires disclosure at the country and project level. That means any company that is doing a project, they would have to disclose the revenues based on that project or the payments. Any other total taxes, et cetera, that they're paying at the country level, they would have to disclose. We believe it's a groundbreaking provision because it's going to shine a light on billions of dollars of payments that companies are making to governments, and these have all been previously hidden. There's been this opacity in the sector, so now this is a game changer. It's shining a light on all of this money. And it will really give citizens in resource-rich countries the ability to combat natural resource corruption and to demand more government accountability, because in some of these countries, we didn't even know how much money was being generated through the extractive sector. It wasn't made public, so it was very hard to know how much money was generated and then how to hold the government to account for it. And I wanted to mention that some of the companies are on board with this and already doing it because they realize that it's in their interest. Companies like Tullow, Newmont, Statoil, and others all see the benefits for doing it. And the good news is that other countries like the European Union have actually followed the U.S. and have adopted their own policy that's very close to the Dodd-Frank provision. So that means you've got a lot of oil, gas, and mining companies that are now covered and have to do this kind of disclosure. And then I just wanted to basically mention one other initiative, and that's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. That's a global multi-stakeholder group initiative. You've got companies, NGOs, and governments that sit on that initiative, including the U.S. Government. It's actually a board member right now. And that's a unique initiative because you have the multi-stakeholder group approach trying to work to strengthen the governance of the sector. There are 41 countries that are part of it. A lot of them are African countries. That's the good news. A lot of African countries have signed up. You've got 22 African countries, 14 of which are now compliant. And the really exciting thing about the EITI right now is that there's a new standard that was just agreed to last year that's going to require all sorts of new information about the extractive sector to be made public. That includes information on project level payments like the Dodd-Frank requires, licensing, how is licensing done, making sure there's transparency around that so there's not corruption. They're also encouraging transparency of contracts and of the ultimate owners, the beneficial owners of the companies that are granted these licenses. And I just want to say that I think the EITI and all of this transparency movement is really premised on the idea that citizens, donors, institutions like the IMF, et cetera, will use this information to then hold the governments to account, to really ask questions about how is this being managed, how can we improve this, where is this money going? And so one really critical aspect is not just getting the information out, but then using it. And that's where we are right now. We're going to have over the next year or two lots of new information about the extractive sector in many different countries, all the resource-rich countries. And so the question now is using that in a way that's going to really improve things. And we're not saying that transparency is going to solve all the problems, but we do believe it's a really crucial stepping stone, because if you don't have transparency, it's really hard to get at some of the root of some of these problems. And even shining a light, making things more transparent, does deter corruption. It makes people think twice about some of these deals that they might do and think we can get away with it or we can't. It's all going to be out in the open. So just in conclusion, that the three things that I think the U.S. government can really focus on, the different State Department, USAID, the Department of Defense, is really making transparent, responsible management of natural resources an integral part of the U.S. foreign policy and aid. And I'm talking about this whole concept of open contracting, really getting transparency across the value chain with revenues, license allocations, contracts, and beneficial ownership. Also with dealing with conflict, that's a whole nother discussion, but there's things that can be done, not just supply chain due diligence, not just making sure that companies aren't sourcing minerals from armed groups, but a lot more analysis of the role of minerals in driving these conflicts. Because I think that gets shortchanged a lot in really understanding the economic drivers and the role of natural resources in that, so you can get a better grip on it. The other really important focus, I think, needs to be on increasing capacity of African governments. This is to negotiate better natural resource deals. As we heard earlier, sometimes bad resource deals can be agreed, and they might be negotiated because a corrupt official wants to pocket some money, or they could be bad resource deals because the government doesn't have the capacity to negotiate with an oil company and get a fair deal for their country and the citizens. So there is the need for building up the institutions and the capacity to do that. And there are some U.S. programs. There's an energy governance and capacity program initiative by the State Department that's trying to work with countries to promote better governance in the energy sector. We do think that it would be good to have very concrete benchmarks on these transparency, good governance mechanisms connected with those programs. And then I would just say, lastly, I think on the ground in resource-rich countries, supporting civil society in the country to demand accountability of resource revenue use, I think, is one of the big, absolutely crucial factors for the next couple of years. As I said, we're going to have all this data coming out about the sector. And so now we need to analyze that information, and citizens and others in the country can use that information to try to promote better governance. And hopefully within the government as well, the more information you kind of get out there could provide a strong incentive for governments to better manage the sector. So I think the U.S. government needs to not only be working with governments to try to make these policies happen, but really supporting civil society, particularly in countries that are where it's very difficult, where it can be very difficult for groups to speak out on human rights or corruption issues. Particularly, I'm thinking of countries like, Angola or Equatorial Guinea, where there are significant oil, revenues, and yet, there continue to be ongoing corruption concerns. So I think on the ground, support from the U.S. government for trying to use this information and really trying to support civil societies when they challenge governments on these issues. So I think that I'll close with that.